And that Stellantis factory may be right in our backyard, but the decision to move production is being felt right across the country.
Our Glen McGregor standing by right now in Ottawa. Glen, the PM has released a statement on this matter. We know there's a cabinet meeting underway. We're expecting to hear a whole lot today.
Yeah, hoping to hear from the Prime Minister more above and beyond the statement that he's issued, which basically blames Trump's tariffs for causing this. In fact, I'll read you the full text of the statement that Carney put on social media this morning, saying, together with the government of Ontario and Unifor, we are working with the company to develop the right measures to protect Stellantis employees and create new opportunities for them in and around Brampton. We have further made clear that we expect Stellantis to fulfill the undertakings they have made to the workers of Brampton. But none of this should be a surprise to Mark Carney, because he was there in the Oval Office last week for his meeting with President Trump. Going to that meeting, the expectation was their negotiations were going to be focused on the steel and aluminum sectors, possibly some discussions as well about Canadian energy, and also the softwood lumber industry, so important to British Columbia and parts of Quebec. However, Trump really tried to steer the conversation often back to the issue of the auto sector, talking about how although Canada and the U.S. have worked together in the auto sector for many, many years, they are still essentially competitors. They are competing for jobs. That is kind of different from the approach that U.S. presidents in the past had taken, really going back to the 1960s. In fact, 1965, the year the Auto Pact was signed, basically a free trade agreement in the auto sector that allowed cars to be built both in the United States in Canada. It was beneficial for the big four automakers in the U.S. because they got access to Canadian labor as well as access to the Canadian market for their vehicles, tariff-free. That even preceded the signing in the 1980s of the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, and that later became the NAFTA, then USMCA, or CUSMA as we call it now. So there's a long history of this. But Trump was saying in the Oval Office, as Carney sat there not saying anything, Trump repeatedly talked about his desire to move factories from Canada and presumably from Mexico back to the United States, even though this agreement was in place, saying that American consumers want cars made in the United States. So now, where does this leave Carney? Well, we know these negotiations with the U.S., which include discussions of the auto sector, are still going on. In fact, there are Canadian officials in Washington today. We think Dominic LeBlanc, the minister responsible for Canada-U.S. trade, is also in Washington at this point, likely meeting with some of his counterparts, potentially with Howard Lutnick, the U.S. Commerce Secretary, seeing if we can get an agreement to end the tariffs that are on the auto sector, as well as all the other sectors that are causing so much problems, steel and aluminum being the top ones there. But really no progress. So the question is becoming increasingly for Mark Carney, what have you got to show for this negotiation that is going on since you became Prime Minister back in March? Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader, putting out a tweet this morning, sort of mocking Carney for not getting any results and saying, you know, since he met with Trump a week ago, in fact, we've got all these new tariffs, including this one, and he sort of jokingly refers to Carney as the master negotiator. Now, in fairness to Carney, it's uncertain if Pierre Poilievre was Prime Minister now, if the Conservatives had won the election, whether or not this relationship would be going any better, whether or not there had been any progress. But I think a couple of crucial things coming up we want to hear from Carney on. First of all, is what kind of steps is he going to take to respond? Will he talk about finally putting some counter tariffs on the U.S., retaliatory tariffs on this if they keep taking jobs in the auto sector, which is so important to Ontario's economy, from Canada and moving them to the United States? At what point also are they going to reconsider subsidies that the federal government is paying to these big auto companies, Stellantis included? $5 billion upfront investment made in 2023 to allow Stellantis and a Korean partner to build an electric vehicle plant in Windsor, Ontario. I think there's going to be questions about whether or not that should continue, practice should continue, particularly because Stellantis stands to earn up to $12 billion in sort of tax rebates and other incentives through this construction of this plant based on the production, whether or not they, depending on how many batteries that they can produce and how many workers they employ and how much revenue they bring in. But that is potentially in question now. The other issue here is, of course, the tariffs on Chinese-made vehicles coming into Canada. Canada imposed a 100% tariff on Chinese EVs in concert with the U.S. The idea was to protect the North American auto industry, to save our jobs by keeping these cheaply made and or less expensively made Chinese vehicles that are subsidized heavily by the Chinese government from entering the North American market. Now, though, the question is going to be, well, why are we protecting this market if the American companies, the big four, are going to start moving jobs from Canada to the U.S.? Why don't we let the Chinese EVs in? And potentially then China would respond by lifting the tariffs that are hurting farmers in Western Canada who grow canola, or also fishery workers in Atlantic Canada who have also been tariffed by the Chinese. So Carney is really in a conundrum here. He's got premiers angry at him and get lots of different advice. Doug Ford, so far, Ontario's premier, has been really on Team Canada, solidly behind Carney on most developments. But now, with the auto industry really obviously feeling the effects of these tariffs, this is a pretty clear example with these jobs potentially leaving Brampton, that some kind of federal response is going to be required. And I think you're going to see more pressure from Ford on the Carney government to take some kind of action, possibly retaliating against the company, possibly retaliating against the United States in the form of other kinds of tariffs. We just don't know at this hour. We hope we'll find out next time we talk. Mel, Faiza, we'll have a little more clarity from Mark Carney and his government which way they're going on this.
You're raising a lot of good questions there, Glenn. Hopefully we get some answers. Or Glen McGregor in Ottawa. Thanks so much.